All right. It is the evening of February 27th, 2024, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and this evening we're going to spend the majority of this podcast talking about the Q4 and 2023 TKO earnings and earnings call. A ton to digest from that call and from the 10K that was filed by TKO. We're going to talk about the numbers themselves. Did they do well? Did they miss expectations or hit expectations? All that fun stuff. Do a deep dive into both the consolidated TKO forms as well as the UFC breakout. Not going to cover the WWE so much, but we'll hit on the most relevant parts needed. Um, we're also going to talk about the 2024 outlook that was provided by TKO executives, including Ari Emanuel, Mark Shapiro, even WWE President Nick Khan showed up. Lots to unpack today. And no, I did not read the entire filing between the call. It just happened a couple hours and right now, but I did hit the most important parts, and we're going to talk about it from, again, a pretty deep level in some aspects, but a higher overall perspective on the business side. So that will be the biggest and most important topic on the podcast today. We're also going to talk about PFL versus Bellator Champs versus Champs event. Lot to dissect there as well. We're going to talk about what worked and didn't work from a business perspective. Is one brand possibly being hurt by the way the fights went? Right. Obviously, one side got the better of the other in the Champs versus Champs promotion battle. Is it going to actually affect the view of the losing promotion? We'll talk about that as well. And of course, what do we do with Francis Ngannou if you're the PFL? He's obviously doing boxing. He's got the Anthony Joshua fight coming up in 10 days or so. A MMA fight is set up for him, but will it actually happen? We're going to break all of that down. And then last but not least, we have a update on the UFC antitrust lawsuit where mediation is happening between the UFC and the plaintiffs in the case just weeks before the trial is set to start. What does it mean? Can we expect it to really yield any results before the trial? I'm going to break all of that down as well as what TKO executive said about it. So, with that in mind, timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. So, first up, we're going to dive into the numbers here. We're going to take a look again at the consolidated numbers, followed by the UFC numbers broken out. Not going to dive too much into WWE stuff, except for a couple of things I think we need to call out just from a larger TKO company perspective, or something that could hypothetically affect the UFC and we need to be aware of. But for the most part, we're just sticking in the MMA lane today. For WWE breakdown, recommend watching this week's Pollock and Thurston. I believe they're covering this. This is technically before their show is airing, but I'm pretty sure that's what they're doing. So, with that in mind, taking a look at these numbers, the highlights and recent developments we need to talk about here. For full consolidated results, revenue increased 47% or 534.9 million to 1.7 billion total. The increase reflects a increase of the UFC side of 152.1 million, which would be 13% to 1.3 billion in revenue, which is crazy to think about, right? We talked about it on this podcast how big it was when the UFC hit a billion in just revenue. That's not obviously the profit, but still that they're generating $1 billion a year in revenue. They're now at 1.3 billion, and they increased it from 2023 to 2022 by 11. That's, I mean, 13%. That's big when you're at these levels. I mean, that's a ton of money and a big increase. So, big deal there. The other contribution to that, though, is 382.8 million of revenue at WWE associated with the period from September 12th through December 31st of 2023. So, yes, when you look at revenue jumping overall here, 47% increase sounds great, but it's really an increase of 13% plus the WWE revenue on top of it that wasn't in this equation before. And that does have a counter effect, right? In terms of net income. So Net income was 175.7 million, down 213.3 million from 389 the prior period. Decrease primarily reflected increased operating expenses, partially offset by the increase in revenue. Increase in operating expenses primarily reflected increase in selling, general, and administrative, or when they say G&A, of 339. Increase in direct operating costs of 189 million, and depreciation and amortization of 104.6 million. Increase of interest 99.4. So net income takes a hit, right? Because again, you've got all this new operating expense because you've absorbed a company. Um, Adjusted EBITDA increased 29% or 180.4 million to 809 million due to an increase of 75.1 million at the UFC, which is 11%. Um, and the contribution of 163 adjusted EBITDA for WWE. So if we're again, talking about this from we're talking about this from, a perspective of the MMA side, right? 11% adjusted EBITDA increase, which again is fantastic. 755.7 million on that. That's hard to find a business with that type of adjusted EBITDA. I mean, those margins are nuts, which we'll talk about margins here in a second. Cash flows generated by operating activities were 468.4 million, a decrease of 33.3 from 501.7 million, primarily due to lower net income. Free cash flow decreased by 69.5 million to 419.8 from 483 or 489.3 due to decrease in cash flows generated by operating activities and an increase in capital expenditures, which was primarily related to WWE's new headquarters. So free cash flow was hit by the fact they're building this new WWE headquarter facility. I think it's either 25 or 50 million. I have it in the notes somewhere. I want to say 50, but that would make sense for being the majority of the 69.5 million. But that's where a lot of their free cash flow went, which is, makes sense. This is a project already in place. You're in the middle of building this new headquarters. Of course, your free cash is going to be tied up. Cash and cash equivalents were 235.8 million and gross debt was 2.761 billion. So as of December 31st, 2023. So terms of debt, right? Important to cash and cash was only 235 million. Debt is 2.7 billion. This shouldn't be a shock if you followed the Endeavor purchasing the UFC saga and so on and so forth, right? They were so levered purchasing the UFC, which was part of the point, right? Is for that high leverage um, mergers and acquisitions strategy that Endeavor took to build their ecosystem, where you're just buying up companies to either vertically integrate or horizontally integrate, or use synergies of said companies, which often is reduction in staff by using one consolidated staff. There's other synergies too, right? Certain networking or facilities, things like that, but that's usually what a lot of it is. But Endeavor went on a crazy M&A spree of just buying things up to become the big conglomerate, which we've seen a lot of other big conglomerates do. And with that comes a ton of debt. And obviously their purchase of the UFC for 4 billion was heavily levered by debt. So that's where a lot of this debt comes in. WWE has debt too, don't get me wrong, but the majority of this, I believe, or at least a significant portion, is still left over from that debt that was levered by Endeavor to purchase the UFC um, back in 2016. And then again in 2019, 2020, when they bought them outright, right? First they bought 51%, then they bought the rest. So they've done a great job, Endeavor, paying it down, and now again it's up to UFC and WWE to pay the rest of that down. But yeah, it's still very much there, and will come up again in this podcast. Trust me. When we look at the UFC's specific um, breakout here, again, we talked about revenue increase of 152 million or 13% from last year. It's called out here. This is primarily driven by 76.2 million increase in media right and content fees. So that's not US media rights, but we're talking about all the international renewals here. They called some of these out on the call: Canada, India, Australia, Sub-Saharan Africa, European territories, things like that. Um, you know, and we've covered most of the big UFC international media rights negotiations that have occurred as they've popped up, right? I was again the UK rights was a huge thing. That's why they went and did the big UK push. Uh, expect more of that. Where hey, like we've got some important rights coming up in a country, you're going to see probably, definitely one, maybe two events in said country to kind of spur like, hey, this is why you want to pay us for this renewal. It's a good strategy, makes sense, but that's where a lot of that comes from. 42.6 million increase in live events revenue. This one is an interesting one because if you look at live events, um, and that side of things, you had a 34% increase over 2022. Now that's a really big deal, and they started as one of their big highlights of this call. They talked about how in 2023 UFC had 10 highest grossing events, like in UFC, breaking records. They also talked about UFC 295 being obviously number three or one of the top three for MSG, Madison Square Garden, with Pereira versus Jiri, and UFC Austin, hometown, in terms of being the record breaking event for the Moody Center and the record breaking fight night. So the record breaking fight night is a big deal. And I will say, as someone who got to go to that event through the generosity of a friend, um, who and through that friend's work. So I didn't have to pay for tickets, which was amazing. Got great seats, all that fun stuff. Um, benefits of consulting, y'all, and friendships, just friendships actually. Uh, with that, right? Uh, I had looked at tickets before I got to go to that event because it was last minute that I even got um, the opportunity to go, and tickets were crazy expensive compared to 2022. And 2022, on paper, in my opinion, had a better card. 2023's card was fine, but I mean, 2022 had Emmett Cater and just um, a pretty stacked fight night event card, and this one was not as stacked yet. So sorry, you can, sure, but yeah, it was not a like, whoa, this card is incredible. And again, I thought 2022's was better, but the prices were, I want to say, I wrote it down somewhere. I want to say like a 50% increase compared to the previous year. It was nuts. And that place was packed. And it was one of the few places where, again, early prelims, I think by fight two or three, most people were getting in their seats. So yay for living here and having to pay those ticket prices again. Hopefully I get to utilize my networking to not pay that. But nevertheless, that's a complete side note here. Point is, you had a big increase in live events, um, and they tout all this, but a huge part of this is because they had an additional pay per view in 2023 that will not be in 2024. So they're going to have one less pay per view, and they had 5 additional international events with live audiences. So yeah, that's going to draw, right? Like, especially some of these international events where this is the first time being there, like second, third time being there, they're going to draw massive numbers there. So that's where that 34% increase comes from. And it is reflected in the operating costs too, right? When you look at adjusted EBITDA, that's gone up 11%, and it was partially offset by increase in expenses. The increase in expenses, according to this filing, primarily reflected an increase of 57.8 million in direct operating costs. This was primarily due to an increase of 45.7 million in athlete costs from different matchups, as well as higher production costs associated with having one additional pay-per-view event and 5 additional international events with a live crowd compared to the prior year. Marketing and venue costs also increased due to the additional 5 events with live audiences in 2023. Selling, general, and administrative expenses increased by 16.9 million, primarily driven by higher personnel costs from greater headcount and increased travel and other expenses associated with the additional pay-per-view and international events. So I've said this over and over, right? This goes back to last week with the Apex shows. This is a huge part of the reason those Apex shows are never going away. And if anything, they're going to increase, is because they've just called out in their filing that a big part of the increase is due to the production of additional live shows and an additional pay per view and travel and logistics, right? Which makes sense. Think about all of the crew needed to set everything up, to do all of the, camera and TV work. They got that DJ just playing weird, old, crappy rock music remixes from like 2010, just just going wild. Sometimes DJ does do a good job, but the fact they just have a live DJ there, I mean, that guy, he's got to be a high price tag, right? Jokes aside, the logistic part of it adds up. Think about it anytime you've gone on a trip to just go see friends, especially nowadays, right? I'm gonna go visit somebody for the weekend. Okay. And imagine you can't stay at their house, right? I'm gonna go see a friend for the weekend. Well, flights round trip, you get them early enough. Maybe $300 or $400, depending on where you're going. Hotel expenses adds up to be another $200 or $300, depending on where you're staying, right? What level you're staying at. And these guys are staying at nicer hotels, right? We know from Embedded and from seeing Fighter hotels, it's not like they're staying in Motel Sixes. They're staying at more expensive hotels, and I'm sure there's deals and things like that. Sure, but yeah, I mean, you're paying a little bit more there. Point is, after a weekend trip like that, especially with cost of food and all the other stuff, just per person, it can add up to be a grand or more depending on what you're doing. And so imagine you've got a whole crew, you've got to do all that stuff with, you've got equipment, I mean, it adds up quickly. Internationally, flight tickets, I mean, hotel, yeah. It again increases exponentially. Maybe not hotels as much. Flight tickets though, yeah. And even for US events, when you're flying in people from overseas, which happens all the time, like, every event has some international travel to it usually. It's what it is. So that's a big part of this. The increased headcount is because, again, you've got that merger of WWE and UFC, which they said on the call. They talked about, something they're working towards is that 50 to $100 million in cost reduction through staff synergies, which is really layoffs, right? We've seen a lot of layoffs on the WWE side. We've seen the global partnership team essentially be formed to do sponsorships. And it's now one consolidated team. It's going to handle both businesses. There's just going to be more of that. And they said they're hoping to get to the upper end of that. So you can certainly expect more layoffs on the corporate side. I don't know if it'll be more WWE or more UFC, right? It's hard to say. WWE has a lot more employees, but they did just lay off a fair amount. So it could be both moving forward. Um, Especially if they're trying to get to the 100 million, I would assume you'd have to lay off some UFC people, but who knows, right? It's honestly hard to say at this point. Um, but yeah, so while live event revenue is up, and we talk about in the grand scheme of things, live event revenue is not that big for the UFC compared to media rights and sponsorships, but it's up a ton. And I've already seen a couple of people being like, "Wow, they're killing ticket prices. Ticket prices are going to stay higher forever." Blah, blah, blah. It's part of it, but that's not all of it, right? That's a big thing in regards to live events having 6 additional events, including one pay per view. You're going to see that decrease in Q1. They talked about on the call that they don't like giving out quarterly guidance. They only want yearly guidance because of the variables. And they said for Q1, there's going to be a decrease in certain things because we're going to have fewer live events and a fewer pay per view. Yeah, makes sense. Makes total sense that that's going to drop. But costs are going to drop too, right? So that's, I guess, the added benefit to that. And from the UFC perspective, WWE is a little bit different because you're going to have your WrestleMania, your SummerSlam, your Royal Rumble, Survivor Series. I think those are the big four, and then you have pay per views in between, mostly too. Their schedule's kind of set, so you have an idea of when everything's coming quarterly. For UFC, it's kind of random outside of International Fight Week and the MSG card. And even then, those cards can be less stacked than normal, but those are the two you expect. Okay, there's probably going to be bigger cards, and then it's a complete crapshoot in terms of whether or not you're going to get a stacked, a 299, which is pretty stacked top to bottom nowadays for the UFC standards nowadays, or you're going to get something like a 297, which the UFC admits it wasn't the card they wanted to put together. It comes down to a lot of moving parts in the UFC. So I do agree from a yearly basis analysis, it makes more sense to compare than quarter to quarter because for UFC anyway, quarter to quarter is going to be much tougher to do. That being said, I mean the highest this past year they had the highest prelim viewership average, which means again got that growth going, and this is pre WWE synergies, which we'll get to here in a bit. But I mean, yeah, it's good stuff all around when you take a look at revenue and adjusted EBITDA on the UFC side. One important call out that we need to talk about is adjusted EBITDA margin, which is the only thing on these financials from the UFC side, at least in terms of revenue and so on and so forth, that decreased. So adjusted EBITDA margin dropped from 60% to 58%. And if you're looking at, the notes and the release that they did, you've got a big old paragraph for revenue explaining everything, adjusted EBITDA, everything, and adjusted EBITDA margins just decreased from 58% to 60%. I just want to briefly touch on what adjusted EBITDA margin is. So, adjusted EBITDA margin really focuses much more on operating costs, right? It's not bound by GAAP rules or general accounting principles type stuff. Like it's not bound by those same rules, so you can get a little creative with it. But what it looks at for the most part is seeing, how well you're doing from an operating profit standpoint in terms of reducing your expenses. That's really what you have seen it used for. You can't say like, oh, their EBITDA margin is so high, so they're making like a crazy profit or what. I mean, I've heard people use the term essentially that it's, revealing the like if you look at Investopedia, right? EBITDA margin measures a company's operating profit as a percentage of its revenue, revealing how much operating cash is generated for each dollar of revenue earned. Um, Therefore, good EBITDA margin is relatively high to compare peers. Yeah, yes, it is kind of like a good way to look at this when you're trying to compare two companies in the same industry. And just trying to get a feel for, how much are they actually like making revenue in terms of their costs. EBITDA margin helps you compare those two and take a look and be like, okay, like got it. Like this, if one has a significantly higher EBITDA margin than another, whoever has the higher EBITDA margin is almost certainly doing better and is leading, right? And even if they're kind of around the same, like 1 or 2 percentage points off, okay, they're doing about the same. It's a good company to company comparison when you can't really do apples to apples in these cases, especially in the UFC's case, right? We don't have PFL's numbers or one's numbers. We have the old filing for one, but those are a whole nother thing with the barter transactions and all that. We don't have the new ones anyway. Thanks a lot, John Nash, and myself too. I guess I did one time. I also reported on it, but still, it's mostly John's fault. But that being said, it's mostly used. I've seen it used to do two things, and that is compare companies to each other, which for the UFC that doesn't really apply, and TKO doesn't really apply, right? WWE and AEW could kind of, but it's not even that. It's yeah, and so that would be a little bit more of one if we had AEW's numbers. We don't. We could look at UFC's versus PFLs if we had PFL's numbers, but we don't have those. I mean, and even then, it's they're so different because of the UFC's market position that it would be right. Just keep in mind that what is generally considered a good EBITDA margin in a lot of industries depends on the industry, but it's 10%. UFC has 58, had 60% last year. Um, So yeah, trying to compare based on EBITDA margin is don't even bother. The other thing it does though is it talks or gives a glimpse into rather um, into operating expense, right? It's sometimes like companies will use it to kind of shield debt because debt isn't brought into EBITDA margin whatsoever. So again, that's important here because of 2.7 billion in debt. So yes, we flash EBITDA margin being massive, great, woo, but that doesn't account for all this debt you got over here. And younger startups or startups that are trying to get profitable and all this stuff will use EBITDA margin as like a big like, hey, look at me, don't look at this crazy pile of debt we have. Like, look at our EBITDA margin, like give us more money, right? But it's used as kind of a window into how are you doing compared to your costs, right? How is your revenue compared to your costs? What's your from a high level, is your revenue going up and your costs going down? And are your cost cutting measures working? And so the fact that their EBITDA margin decreased, even ever so slightly, right? Didn't increase when you had adjusted EBITDA increase or revenue increasing, you have a decrease just a little bit. That shows some of this cost bloat that they've acquired by merging with WWE. And that's part of the $100 million cost reduction synergy stuff that Ari's talking about, where it's like we gotta eliminate teams, right? G&A, selling and I mean, that's also partially personnel and payroll, so that'll be part of it. Eliminating certain factors and increasing, sponsorships and stuff like the Honda Center deal, right? That was announced with WWE and UFC, and kind of having that cross promotion. But also, uh, this was asked on the TKO earnings call. Um, right? They were, what are some of the benefits of doing these shows in a single weekend? Well, one, they said you get to pitch the venue rental as a two event type package, so you can kind of entice a place to, hey, like you get UFC and WWE. It doesn't even have to be the same weekend, they said, right? You can just kind of pitch it that way. And then even if it's different weekends, great. But then, as I've stated multiple times when this merger was announced, the big benefit is if you do it in the same weekend, a Saturday and Monday, um, you like which that's generally what it is, Raw, or you could do SmackDown Friday and Saturday if SmackDown's live, right? Like that makes sense. Friday and Saturday is even better. You save on logistics and productions because you can have the same production crew once they get everybody trained up and you get those knowledge transfers going of, hey, I'm a WWE guy, how do you do this UFC thing? Hey, I'm a UFC guy, how do you do this WWE thing? Great, now we have a bunch of people that know both sides of the house. Awesome, let's reduce it to the minimal team number possible. Great, we've got that done, and now we're going to have that team go work Friday and then work Saturday, and you don't have to pay for additional flights. You don't have to pay for additional meals, hotels. It's just extending it all. The hotel's extended by a day, right? I mean, that that's where so much savings comes in. Um, and I think right now that's what a glimpse into the adjusted EBITDA is, where just they have some of these higher costs. I mean, part of that too, right, is those additional live events and things. But I think it's part of where they're trying to cut even more. And yes, this is just the UFC side of the house, but it still tells me that okay, production costs are a little bit higher, and yes, and operating costs are a little bit higher. And again, that's the 5 extra international events, great, and the pay per view. But it shows the effect on that, right? Um, because I have no doubt this is going to increase moving forward. But the fact that it's the only thing that decreased shows that this is an area that they really want to focus on. And UFC mostly, again, has this lockdown. They are very good at this. They will only get better at this. TKO's adjusted EBITDA, I imagine, is going to grow quite a bit. I don't think the UFC's is going to grow as a standalone that much more. It will because, again, less live events, all that stuff. But it's just a highlight into what cutting those costs can do, how those things can add up. Because I've been talking about it forever, and some people get it, some people don't. But this is why Apex shows are going to increase because that's how they increase adjusted EBITDA. Less people demand the Apex. Less production. The ring is just always there. I mean, yeah, it's not hard to figure this one out, guys. Um, Adjusted EBITDA margins for WWE stood about 40%, stood about the same too, right? So, um, again, I think that will only increase as time goes forward, especially on the WWE side. But just wanted to call that out. I know, long way to get there, but important. Um, Full year guidance for 2024 for TKO. Company is targeting 2.575 to $2.650 billion. So in that range, right? When they talk about earnings miss, all this other stuff, that's just their guidance. So if a company revises their guidance down, usually stock is going bleh. If it's revising up, great. Usually goes up. But this is the company's guidance, not the analysts. Like if you see, oh, an earnings miss or whatever, like we're not talking about that. We're talking about the company's guidance at this point. They also are aiming for adjusted EBITDA of 1.15 to 1.17 billion. So that's pretty huge, right? They are at 755 right now. It only has, you know, September through December of WWE, so that's gonna go up. But still, I mean, that's an increase. And then they're targeting full year free cash flow conversion of excess 50%. Um, so again, these are the core numbers for TKO and UFC. I'm not gonna go any more into the numbers in regards to WWE specifically, but this gives you an idea into where TKO and UFC stand after a full quarter post merger. And a couple themes keep coming up, right? Site fees, which they said on the call is a big deal. Costs, which they're looking at reducing, also talked about on the call. Um, yeah, these numbers, if you're looking at them, are they good or bad? They're good for the UFC, right? They're I don't want to say stellar, but they're from the UFC perspective, they're great. I mean, um, it's the most profitable and best the UFC's ever done. Best year UFC's ever done. Same for WWE too. Um, which we will talk about why the stock after hours dropped. But the fact that it's the best year the UFC has ever done again, and that consistency of growth is happening, highlights to the fact that while the levers the UFC can pull to increase their revenue and adjusted EBITDA and profitability are decreasing, right? They don't have as many as they did before. They still have plenty left to go. Um, in terms of the call, let's take a look at the call notes then, right? So this is what I jotted down. That's what I thought was important. I know John Pollock and Brandon Thurston were both tweeting out some things. John Nash, I think, tweeted out one or two things, but I think those two were the two I saw most on in terms of like, that stream of thought live streaming um, of the earnings call. So again, I'm going to keep referencing those guys a lot because they're doing great work. But yeah, check those out. In terms of what I heard on the call after the fact, I didn't hear it live. I had to listen to the call after. Good old day job. Sponsorships are a major player in why the UFC got its increased revenue and its increase in adjusted EBITDA. Um, Something that was highlighted was towards the end of the call during the Q&A. I forget if it was Ari or Mark who talked about it, but might have been Seth too. They were talking about how the UFC, right, were kind of rudderless in terms of sponsorship. I think we're doing 20 million or something, and when they were bought, where they didn't really have a good grasp on it, and now they've got hundreds of millions lined up for sponsorships, and you've got this huge Anheuser Busch deal, which was highlighted multiple times. Which, yeah, I mean, it's a massive deal for both Anheuser Busch and for TKO and UFC, we've talked about that before. Monster Energy, they highlight and call out as being a big part of it. And they also talk about how those partners, yes, they get money from those partnerships, but they also get marketing. They get crazy marketing from that, like all different contests, different, fighters all over the place. Like it's a big deal. A Super Bowl commercial this year, right? Where with the Bud Light Super Bowl commercial, Dana White's in there at a point of it. And this is while, Bud Light's trying to and Anheuser-Busch trying to get Bud Light to do a pivot because of the whole we're not even going down that road, but obviously there was a lot of blowback from a decision they made. And so they're trying to pivot pretty hard using the UFC to pivot to the particular audience they want to cater to makes sense. I mean, it's huge. And they talked about just how there's still so much potential in the partnership realm, right? They touted their new global partnerships team, which is it sounds like it's pretty much set, right? They've kind of worked out all the pieces, and it makes sense that they if they see the best and biggest potential in sponsorships, that was one of the first things they wanted to get organized post merger between WWE and UFC, getting the right people in those roles, and um, you know sharing knowledge in terms of how to gain those sponsorships at both a national and local level, which they stated WWE was very good at local, UFC was not. Now they've got was good at national, and now they have the best of both worlds, right? So that is highlighted all over the place. They're going to continue to go after new and bigger sponsors. I imagine you're going to see probably some more stuff on the ring. You're going to see more things like the what was it, the hydration stations and things like that. And I gotta think with the crypto stuff being all wonky, that as soon as that deal is up with and I don't know if it's exclusive or not. That's the thing. It might very well be exclusive, which is why they haven't added other sponsors on walkout jerseys because that's prime real estate, right? Like they've gone all over the canvas. They've done a clock, all this other stuff. There's so much prime real estate on jerseys. I don't know if it's an aesthetic that they're really just like trying to keep. I don't think it is at this point. I think it's probably there's some exclusion on who can be added to jerseys with the crypto.com deal. But like once that's up, or maybe, they're just trying to get more more money for jersey sponsorships. There's gonna be a change to jerseys and things like that. I don't know if you'll see the old school jerseys where everybody got their own sponsors and it was kind of a human billboard in some cases. But you're gonna continue to see sponsorship increases and different activation points at live events and all these other things. It's just it's just too lucrative and it's clearly an avenue they wanna go. It's the biggest potential revenue avenue UFC has, so they're gonna hit that hard. Site fees are also a huge area for growth, right? This is another thing where you talk about the deal with the Honda Center and you talk about some of the Middle East deals, Saudi Arabia, UFC getting that agreement done. Site fees are big. And another area that the UFC is going to go after aggressively is okay, we've got a lot of events at the Apex and now we've only got so many cards to go to internationally or wherever. You want to, get the huge tourism boost Australia, or you want to get the huge tourism boost France, or you're going to have to pay us a bigger site fee. And they'll negotiate them just like media rights and sponsorship, just like they always do. And again, that's something that WWE is well versed in. UFC's, I'm sure they took the best of both of those worlds and put them together. And I have no doubt that that's an area we'll see a big increase for in terms of revenue because they haven't quite topped out on media rights. We've talked about media rights all year. We're going to talk about media rights even more this year and next year. But a lot of those media rights and the biggest chunk of media rights in the US are locked in. Once the deal's done, it's done. Um, Sponsorships, site fees can always increase, right? Get a 5-year deal with the Honda Center, get a 5-year deal with Saudi Arabia, with Abu Dhabi, lock those in, get that money guaranteed, continue onward. And you'll notice, right? A lot of people, this is a slight detour into pro wrestling, but a lot of people looking at the Netflix deal with WWE Raw were saying, okay, that's you know, not quite a 1.4 increase. They said it was a 1.4 increase or more than a 1.4 increase. I am curious. I didn't do the math on that. I know I had done the math before, and Brandon Thurston had also done the math before where it did not look like 1.4. So I'm curious with the new numbers out if, in this filing, if it looks like that is going to be 1.4 with some of the clarifications they answered on that side. But the questions regarding that. But the the main takeaway that I have from a UFC anal- analyst perspective, right, is they went with a deal where they're talking about media rights deals and they're kind of downplaying it on this call where when they're asked straight up in the Q&A session, are you worried about media rights deals and pressure from, Disney looking to spend less on programming? Do you think it's going to be an issue? And they say we've got premium content, and premium content's always going to dominate fees. A lot of the other stuff will get cut, sure, but our content is at a premium, and so we're going to get premium money for that. If that statement is true, why would you lock yourself in to something like UFC rights or Raw rights for 10 years? Right? They did the Raw rights are 10 years with a 5-year option of closing and then another 5-year addition. So you could be locked into this to 15 years or something like that. If you truly believe, oh, we have premium content, we're always going to do well in rights renewals, even when the market's in trouble, why lock it in for so long? Right? And what I believe the overall strategy here is, TKO, which I don't disagree with, is okay, lock in those deals, get that money, guaranteed revenue, which helps to lower athlete costs on both sides because we don't need you, Conor McGregor. We don't need you, Ronda Rousey. Oh, WWE said, oh, Cody Rhodes, oh, you want to go back to AEW? Cool, go. That's fine. We don't need you because we have a $5 billion deal with Netflix. So it helps push that down, right? From the UFC perspective, that was always a big lesson learned in terms of watching the leverage Conor McGregor got. And, in some of the presentations and documents that have been released in the antitrust suit, they talk about this as a risk and something they have to kind of work at doing is, we want them to be a star, but not, be so big they become bigger than the brand. This is the same case with WWE, which WWE has been that way for a long time. Don't get me wrong. They have been much more in a position of, um, especially with just the nature, right? Like where the outcomes stories are all planned out. Um, they've been in that position for a while, but still, right? AEW pops up and is their first legitimate threat, semi-legitimate. I don't know if it was ever really a threat, but biggest threat. We'll just go with that. Biggest threat in forever, and much more of a threat than TNA was for back in the day. Um, in my opinion. This was a bigger threat than that. And bigger threat pops up. No issue with WWE still being the clear number one and all that, but you don't want to have to worry about, okay, like now there's another company out there that can pay your athletes more. You don't want, your Cody Rhodes or some of these other big wrestlers to all leave at once or all go over to the other promotion and then actually, cause some trouble. And now you don't have to worry about it nearly as much. Now you have 10 years to build whatever wrestling star you want. And it's going to be way easier than the UFC because you don't have to try and find that talent. They have to win, blah, blah, blah. You get to craft the stories, push whatever. I mean, it's a completely different thing. Keeps the brand above all else secure. That's what that does. And then, yeah, you might miss out on certain rights increases, of course. You are definitely leaving money on the table for a 10-year deal like that for a 1.4x increase. Now, they know that the media rights market is in bad shape. And so for the next several years at least, right, they're going to probably be making good money because they've locked this in. But if the market comes back, right, with a big force, which who knows where it will go because this is I'm not I don't know enough about media analysis to get into that. But this, you know, sure, maybe by year 7 or 8 you're leaving money on the table, but it's guaranteed money you have that will weather you through a storm, and it keeps the brand secure because you can now push back any which way you want. That's exactly what happened with the UFC, right? They wouldn't pay Brock Lesnar, he wanted to come back. They wouldn't pay him what he wanted. Too bad. Connor and the UFC got in several arguments. I mean, Nate Diaz, there were so many fighters that were bigger. John Jones, I want X amount of money to fight Francis Ngannou. Go up and do this. Okay, you can sit on the side. Henry Cejudo, go ahead and retire. We're not going to pay you. WWE can now easily do that too, at least for Raw. SmackDown, I forget how long the length is, but yeah, I mean, at least for a certain period of time, right? That's important. It keeps the brand secure. That's definitely something I picked up on in regards to that. Um, and partnerships, right? You've got that stable media rights income locked in for your local rights anyway. You still go out there and do international and do all those deals, but you focus on sponsorships and partnerships, and you focus on international rights deals where you can, but you've got your base set. So you can go after these other deals, and that's where you focus because again, you don't need you don't need the athletes, the wrestlers that way. It's all about the brand, and that's what building an ecosystem is all about. And that's something Ari Emanuel has always realized, um, been very good at realizing. I think is it's about the brand. Yes, individuals are important to help build that. Of course, yes, there are stars and people that stand out, and all, of course, but the brand has to be above all else. It's also something that Vince McMahon, right? Which we're not going to get into Vince McMahon stuff, but Vince McMahon and WWE have, I think, recognized and cultivated is it's about the brand above the individual star. It has to be. This helps reinforce that. Um, looking at some of these other notes, let's see. Sponsorships increased 18% over the past year, so that's big, right? Again, just shows where they're going and talking on the call, that's where they want to go. Um, media rights for UFC are important, but and are top of mind according to some of the notes and things that they talked about. But it's not the end all be all, which again makes sense. They expect premium, and I don't think they'll get their 1 point. I don't think they'll get their double. I think that's what they were originally going for was double. No, I think the market's too soft or hard, too hard for that. The market's not going to allow double media rights by the time that comes up in 2025. I think, unfortunately, their window for that probably closed. You know, early last year is when stuff got, and maybe not right because again, it's good. Here's what I'll say about this because they did talk about NASCAR. They talked about college football playoff rights, getting a huge boost with ESPN and CFP having that deal done where they got a huge increase, and first right refusal for NFL games. How Amazon upped that. They talked about that, and they believe that UFC is premium content and WWE is as well. It's gonna prove one way or another if it is. I think WWE kind of proved where it was based on the fact it's hotter than it's been since I can remember in a long, long time. And they only got 1.4. Their ratings now, I mean, their ratings now are pretty huge to the point where you got to imagine if they had waited to renegotiate a little bit, could have been maybe a little bit better, but hard to say. Still, the market conditions are not great. So come 2025, I can't see a 2 times increase. 1.5, yes. Easily see that. I could see as high as 1.8, and I could be wrong. I could be very wrong, but 2 times increase, given where I believe the market is headed and where it will be in 2025, you'd need 2 times increase, you need a partner that is fully all in on the content, which could happen at something like Disney, right? If that's really where they're going with ESPN's direct to consumer streaming service and ESPN Plus, where it's like it's UFC land, then maybe, but I don't know. It's going to be tough. I do believe it's more of a premium than a lot of other rights, and I believe UFC's rights are more at a premium than WWE's for sure. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that increase. Focus on free cash flow in their outlook. Is lessening of net leverage. So it's, debt reduction. They expect extra cash. They're looking at different investments, possibly dividends, which every analyst and investor loves to hear, like, oh, you're going to have extra cash on hand and you might give it back to us in terms of dividends. Well, great. Or stock buybacks to bump up the stock price. Great. Of course, they're going to say that stuff, but you're going to have extra cash on hand and kind of reducing debt, which makes sense as interest rates go up because they still have, a ton of variable debt, right? And interest rates look like they might start to go down, and then new inflation data said, maybe not. So there's been no rate cuts. Rates could increase or stay steady like this for a long time. So they're trying to get rid of that 40% variable debt that is now around 7% when they bought it for, I forget, it was like 2% or something crazy. So yeah, they've got to focus on that. Um, PLEs for WWE is still on the table. That's something we have to talk about. So all the rights are pretty much divvied up on the wrestling side in WWE, except for their premium live events, which that's what's on Peacock right now. Right when you watch like Royal Rumble or WrestleMania, any of that, that deal is coming up soon. I think 2026, March. I think or 2025. No, I think it's 2026. Not the same as UFC. Maybe it's 2025, 2026. Either way, that's some more revenue that they can kind of pull the lever on. I hate to say this if you're a wrestling fan and you're watching this. I think pay per views are coming back. I think they're going to do something like that. ESPN data, the UFC will show WWE, hey, here's where our pay per views have been at. Maybe you should try it. And again, WWE is real hot. And we'll see. We'll see. I don't know that for sure by any means, but I wouldn't be shocked if some of the bigger ones pay-per-views come back. Or they'd need a real big offer from something like Peacock, or Deal Place that wouldn't matter how many buys come in. We're getting almost certainly more money just so they have the content. That's the ideal scenario if you're a fan, and honestly for the UFC, because again, guaranteed instead of that variable. They don't love variable. Um, TKO, not UFC. Production savings we already covered, premium content sales, and top three revenue synergies. Again, they said partnerships is one of those huge ones. They also noted in the filing that they had 34.2 million in legal costs tied to um, legislation, right? So WWE still has the Vince McMahon scandal, still very much a dark cloud over the organization. It's still there. I know talk about it has died down in some circles, but it's still very much there, and things are moving on that. They had a $20 million payout, assumably to, it says antitrust issues WWE, but that's to MLW, which again, check out Paul and Thurston for that stuff. But there's still the UFC antitrust lawsuit too, so we'll get to that as well later in the show. But that's that's legal costs and litigation that's still hanging over TKO as they're trying to kind of make this pivot. I mean, the craziest thing with all this stuff, right? I know I've gone on for a long time now and gone a lot of different ways with this. I believe I've hit all the big notes and the big numbers here. Um, Viewership on linear ESPN grew 35% over 2022. That's big too, right? Especially as they go up for media rights deals renewal in the US. The fact that they grew 35% over a year on linear ESPN, so not ESPN Plus stuff, just on ESPN. That's a very big deal. I think there were more events shown on ESPN this time around compared to other times too. So that might be part of it, but still, those are numbers that they will definitely trot out in front of their media partners during renegotiation rights. Is that everything on notes? I think so. But one last note on all of this. So WWE and UFC both have their best year ever financially. Um, Margins are up on the UFC side. Uh, you've got the added WWE profit. I mean, numbers in general look pretty great here. The debt, 2.7 billion, not the best, but honestly, Endeavor had a much higher debt load, almost double, I think. I think maybe even over double debt load when they had just the UFC as their only profitable thing, and then you had like a bunch of other things that were not doing well. So they're much better than Endeavor was in the shape that Endeavor used to be in. Numbers look great. But if I go to TKO stock right now and I look at where the stock closed at $86.30, the after hours has dropped to 83.4. So a drop of 3.36%. This is important because I cannot stress enough that even though these numbers are amazing and it's great, you're almost certainly going to see the stock down tomorrow. That would be my guess. And sometimes you have these after hour sell offs where like people wait until the end of the day to sell and then it kind of causes that big dip and it's whatever. And then next day it bounces back. But wouldn't be shocked, let me put it this way, if the stock is down tomorrow, despite all these great numbers. And so much of that is perception, right? One person asked about on the call asked about competition and if they, PFL, all this stuff. The PFL is nowhere near a competitor right now against the UFC. Could it eventually become one? Of course. Technically, yes. But the fact that this is looming over, like, oh, Saudi's invested in PFL, and I've seen articles and things that have come out. Right, there was a Bloomberg Law article about it. There was a Northwestern professor, a professor at University of Northwestern in Chicago, not too far. I have several friends that went to Northwestern, right, not too far from where I grew up, and this professor writes about like the implications of the impacts of where this antitrust suit could go, and that like, oh, there's stuff with live and tenant, like it's it just shows at a high level that perception is almost everything with this stuff. Right. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know more about the overarching business um, side of the UFC than most of the people who have bought the stock. The majority, I would say. Um, and I'm not even that good. I mean, I'm not tooting my horn to the level of being like, I'm that. And it's like, I do okay. So I am no savant at this stuff. So again, do not be shocked if we go through all this, you listen to this and you're like, wow. And then you see like, well, he said everything went so well and all these numbers are great. He said how awesome this is for the company from a business perspective, which it is. I mean, you love to see all this. I mean, you don't love to see the litigation stuff and all that, of course, but like the numbers, yeah, those are numbers you're happy about. Only thing you could ask for is a higher adjusted EBITDA margin. But that all being said, right? Uh Stock may be, down 10% by the end of the week. I don't know. The fundamentals do not reflect the stock price. Keep that in mind. These are from a business perspective, if I'm Ari and Co. and I'm TKO, I'm super happy, especially given all the turmoil with Vince McMahon and all the other stuff that's happened recently. I'm very happy because these numbers are great. And yeah, I'm not not staying up at night worried about PFL. So there's that. I think I hit everything from a UFC and from a greater TKO consolidated perspective. Again, expect bigger pushes into sponsorships, site fees, things of that nature, cost cutting. I have no doubt they will get. If I had to place a bet right now, I'd say they're going to end up at the end of 2024 near that $100 million in savings they want. Um, and yeah, I think rights renewal will be good. I think it'll be 2x good, but I think it'll be good. Reading in between the lines of what was said. Yeah, I think they're aware that the market is not in the best shape, and they're doing what they can to paint their product as invincible to that or unaffected by that and impervious. That's the word I'm trying to think of. Which is what they have to do. So yeah, that is my TKO earnings analysis. I know that was a big long section. Let me know if you have any questions on anything I went over. Your thoughts on this stuff, right? Do you think sponsorships is the way they're going to go here? Site fees. Do you see an end to the Apex shows? I don't, but let me know if you do, and let me know your thoughts on it. But yeah, that's that's where we are at the end of 2023 in Q4, and next earnings call will be not as fun. Um, but still, it's going to be something interesting. All right. Next up, we are going to talk about something that is completely unrelated to the UFC, except for maybe the fact that John Jones was at this event, and we will have to talk about that. But PFL versus Bellator, champs versus champs, the big kickoff to um, the acquisition of Bellator by PFL, and something they're going to do every year, right? Had a special belt made with a little ring inside of it, that whole thing. So let's talk about this first as an idea, and then we'll talk about execution, go from there. So I love this as an idea personally, right? If I'm thinking about a league type thing, right, they've touted this as they're trying to make this the Champions League of MMA and all of this stuff. And we've talked multiple times about how great it would be to see UFC versus PFL or Bellator versus UFC or PFL, all this stuff. And Bellator did a fantastic job with Bellator versus Ryzen, where they kicked this off and it drew interest, right? You were curious to see how it went. So again, idea, absolutely love it. Execution, I will say that PFL from a production standpoint came a long way. Yeah, the first fight took a while because they had the pre-show and all this other stuff, but then pacing was so much better than some of their other big cards and pay-per-view cards, especially where they just had dead air for so long and it was just dragging on and on. Um, so great job on that front. Fights were pretty entertaining for the most part on some levels. They had some gimmick-ish fight. I don't want to say gimmick fights, but like some Clarissa Shields fight, right? Like that fight was something that occurred. Um, and yeah, it's a whole nother thing where I don't know where she's going to go for them in terms of star power and drawing eyes, but they had some of those types of fights. But then they had some good champ versus champ fights. Sangane versus Elbin was good, was real good. Um, well, mostly good. Yeah, you had the main event right with Henan Ferreira knocking out Ryan Bader in super quick fashion, setting up that match for Ngannou, which we'll get to intersect. But one thing that happened here, right, is this was not a particularly, for the most part. I mean, Kasangane versus Elbin was close, but this was not a particularly close champ versus champ card. Otherwise, what it was four Bellator, one PFL, and that one was Ryan Bader getting knocked out. It it is interesting when you look at what happened post Ryzen versus Bellator, right? Where you'd always wondered and you always thought Bellator was better in general, but seeing Bellator kind of sweep them multiple times, or near sweep multiple times, right? Like clearly beating the brakes off Ryzen fighters doesn't take away from watching Ryzen fights, but you no longer ask the question, right? You no longer say, okay, which is better, Ryzen or Bellator? Well, Bellator clearly has the superior fighters, right? And it doesn't mean that can't change, right? Or especially if you have closer fights, and they can be exciting. You get a lot of finishes that way. That's kind of what this was. But when your whole merger and league is going to be centered around this now, that's where it will be very important to see how PFL utilizes these champs and where they put them, right? You don't want to have this annual event and have every year PFL get smoked. I mean, the fact that Enan Farrow won was a great save for PFL, right? If Bader goes out there and does the same to Ferreira, sure, you get Bader versus Ngannou, but then you really get a brand knock of being like, like maybe PFL isn't, really number two, blah blah blah. Like they've been saying all this time. And keep in mind, again, you had close fights, and we've seen PFL demonstrate. I think it's been great that PFL has demonstrated that despite what we like to say in the MMA community about like, oh, well, somebody beat somebody else like 2, 3 times. Like, there's no way that person could ever beat that person. That's not the case, right? Larissa Pacheco Larissa Pacheco is a great example of that. We've seen multiple rematches where it goes a completely different way. We've seen multiple rematches where it goes the same way. But I mean, it's important that moving forward, they don't do from a business perspective. You don't want PFL to always be second fiddle to Bellator because if that happens, that's going to hurt your overall brand. PFL is the name brand, right? Maybe you take one of the Bellator champs that won the champs, and you throw them in a PFL tournament, um, or two, right? Like you can mix up the roster. You own both, so mix up the rosters to balance it out more, basically, um, and recruit. Recruit hard and show, hey, like free agents out there, like UFC free agent name, like they're not paying you, come over here, right? Impa Kansangane won $1 million. Couldn't do that in the UFC probably, but over here, you can make money and get more Shane Burgoses, right? Continue to get those types of recruits for these, and I think it's gonna go well. And I still like the idea, right? This was the first attempt at it. Um, I hope they continue to do it like they said they're going to, and I hope it gets more even, more exciting. I think that will only help build them going forward, especially with the regional type of things they're talking about, where you do a regional PFL, that person wins and gets into a tournament. I think that's going to end up being more popular than people realize, right? When you're watching something, and this is going to get taken the wrong way, I know, but if you're watching something like the World Cup, you know sometimes, right? You know that whoever's coming from, I don't know, let's say Oceania region, which they did much better. They've done much better recently, so can't say that anymore. But um, when I lived there in 2014, lived in Sydney, you knew whoever won the Oceania region, right, for the World Cup was gonna get smoked in the group round. But it was still exciting to see them, okay, like who's gonna win the Oceania region, and then they're the underdogs. Maybe they come in and that's gonna be the thing, right? You're gonna have PFL MENA, whoever wins that ends up going to the big tournament, PFL Europe, all this stuff. Like I think that idea is gonna catch fire. But overall, from a business perspective, I think it was good. They still have things they need to work on. The belts, right? It's definitely weird that Ryan Bader got knocked out super fast and is still going to be Bellator heavyweight champion. Um, They've got to kind of do something about that perception wise, because I've already seen people being like, "Get rid of this stuff. What's going on? Blah blah blah." Get all that. Same and everybody that lost, right? Every PFL champ lost. The one good thing there is that tournament always resets on the PFL side, so it's fine. They're going to vacate anyway, and they'll have to go back to the tournament, do whatever. The Bellator side, Bader, it's like, I guess he'll fight, defend his title now somewhere. It was a non-title fight, right? It just gets kind of Um, but I think business wise, it will be more popular than people realize, and I think it was exciting enough if they can make some modifications to the roster depth on each side and kind of do some of that, it'll be good. But they've got to be careful. They're in a precarious place right now. They got through their first event. You had John Bone Jones and Ngannou, and then they interviewed Jones, saying like, "Well, we're not the ones." You know, the execution of that whole ploy was terrible. Like trying to basically call out the UFC from stopping a cross promotion fight during a cross promotion event. Great idea, but the execution was awful. I mean, Sean O'Connell didn't do a great job. They didn't. I mean, sorry, just didn't. Needed better execution on that. But their headspace is right. And one thing we've seen with the PFL, right? Like they consistently make adjustments and seem to get better. That's how they've survived. They've gotten more sponsorships, right? They're one of the first articles I ever wrote on PFL. Uh, I did not make fans over at the promotion because I talked about ratings and how they needed to get a ratings boost for their end of the year card and all this other stuff. Um, they didn't like what I wrote. Uh, but I came back after they did the ratings they did and said like, yeah, awesome. This is what you needed. This is great. And they've been doing that because that was after season one, I think. They've been doing that pretty consistently. They've been tweaking and making adjustments to the roster, to the brand, to the pace. Things like even their pacing in this show is so much better. They are open to that feedback and they seem to be adjusting well. That they're in a weird spot right now, but they've got a good opportunity to keep pushing forward and to essentially make changes they need to make this a more popular thing and become, a clear cut number two. They're not going to overtake the UFC at least anytime soon, of course. But if you're comparing a WWE to AEW, right? AEW is never going to take over WWE, in my opinion, but they are a clear number two alternative that is still, I think they're on their way to profitability, but like it's something that can grow into an actual, hey, we are carving out enough market share. We can make money here. We can build it into something. PFL is in that position right now, especially after acquiring Bellator. Don't have much hope for one at the moment. I haven't seen enough there, right, to see them come back, especially with the financial issues they're in. Ryzen, I love Ryzen, but again, they're kind of in a not so great space either. Where I hope they continue on. I hope they're making the money they need, all that stuff. But they're, it's not like they're making cash hand over fist, and they're, they're very niche. This has the potential to become a solid number two. They just have to execute it correctly. Um, and then what do you do with Francis Ngannou? Right. This is something where Ngannou being there is good. Talked about his interest in watching fights, but even in the interview beforehand, right, he said that he was very interested in watching Yoel Romero versus Thiago Santos, which ended up being a super boring fight and sucks. But again, that was one of those fights of like, on paper, these names are great. And this is anybody that's watched the past couple fights kind of saw this was coming. But he didn't even talk about like, oh, I'm very excited to see who's going to win the heavyweight bout so I can fight them next. Because he's going to fight Joshua next. And if he beats Joshua, he's not coming back to the cage. I mean, Ferreira wasn't like Ferreira grinded out Bader to a decision and Ngannou was already gone or out the door or whatever. It was he knocked out Bader very quickly and Ngannou had already left that they couldn't get Ngannou in the ring. That's really a bad look. You got to rein Ngannou in at least for that and be like, hey, look, just even you want him, of course, to fight in the PFL cage, of course, and you're pushing for that hard. But in a worst case scenario, you at least have to have him continue the marketing ploy of like, this could happen. This is a whole thing. Because right now, there's a huge part of the hardcore community that's looking at us being like, oh, he's never going to fight. And yeah, I think if he beats Joshua or has a very competitive fight against Joshua, no way. Because all he has to do is stay competitive. He could lose. All he has to do is stay competitive. He still gets the Fury rematch, no problem. If Joshua goes out there and like just drubs him, which I don't think will happen, but if that happens, then maybe he loses the Fury rematch. Maybe it becomes a whole thing. Maybe okay, he's ready for PFL payday. But yeah, I mean, it's not what it is. And yeah, of course, trying to egg John Jones on to have that fight, right? That's of course would draw eyes, be a huge thing, but he's under contract to UFC, can't do anything about it, is what it is. And they're of course UFC is never going to back down there. I don't care what people say, UFC is never going to allow John Jones to fight Francis Ngannou. Very simple cost benefit analysis, no way. But they've got to find a way to market Ngannou and not let him do what he did at that event. Got to go into the cage. Got to be engaged talking about the heavyweight fight where you're supposedly supposed to fight the winner, not the light heavyweight. Um, that's something they've got to adjust on too. So yeah, I mean, again, I'm curious to see what the buy rate is. I don't know if we'll ever get that number. I haven't heard any rumors right now. I don't think it like did particularly well, but I don't think it necessarily bombed. Like, I don't think it was as bad as the Harrison pay per view, but we'll see. Right? We'll see. Hopefully, good numbers out of that though, because ideally, this turns into a solid alternative number two. That's my thoughts on champ versus champ. Let me know if you watched the card, what you thought of it. Um, especially with the John Jones stuff and the Ngannou um, leaving the arena, not coming into the cage type stuff. Let me know all that because yeah, I'm curious to see what fans thought of that event, like real hardcore fans or people that really want to love that as a number two. I love the idea. Execution just needs work. That's kind of where I'm leaving it. All right, super quick update on the antitrust lawsuit update. All right, super quick update on the UFC antitrust lawsuit. Mediation is occurring between the UFC and the plaintiffs. A lot of people have been like, "Whoa, this is it." They're going to come to an agreement. It's going to be over. On the TKO earnings call was asked about, and they said, "Look, we believe the facts and the law are on our side. We're looking forward to showing this in front of a jury, but we are in mediation with them, and this is common practice and no other comment, right?" So yeah, this was always going to happen. Um, and there was also a motion to try and move the date from April 15th, but that got denied. So April 15th is definitely happening in terms of this kicking off if it does go to trial. But the UFC was always going to reach out to the playoffs to try and plaintiffs to try and settle this, right? Um, this was always part of the plan once the class status was certified and appeals got denied. If you are in the UFC's position, you never, ever try and just go straight to trial and just say, all right, let's do it. I mean, remember, it's 12 random people and you never know who you're going to get. And jury selection. There's a whole thing about how jury selection basically determines the outcome of a stupid amount of trials. And it's a whole big deal. You never want to roll the dice. So I mentioned this literally years ago at this point that if class was certified and appeal was denied, they were always going to try and strike a deal and go to mediation. And especially since there's no injunctive relief on the table here, right? It's not like contracts are going to be opened up and all this other stuff, right? That's basically been taken off the table. It's just monetary damages. Yeah, the UFC and TKO would rather deal with it now and, pay a lesser fee than what the 1.6 billion that could happen and, just get it over and done with. Because they still technically have the Johnson 2017 lawsuit, although that one's gonna be even harder to, I think, get to, um, where this one did, but still, right? It's something to consider. It's very important. Um, so I think it makes sense that they're essentially looking to um, settle this. And of course, they were always going to go in mediation. I don't know if anything's going to come of it. I'm not saying that, oh, they're in mediation. So, of course, this is now going to be settled out of court. No, they still have to come to a deal. But this is unexpected. Or, sorry, not unexpected. This is very expected. This was always going to happen. And they're going to be in mediation up until the day of the trial that it kicks off, even through the trial, right? You can still cut a deal while the trial's going on before the jury reaches a verdict. So I know a lot of people are like, whoa, this is a huge thing. Yeah, it's important it's called out and there's a filing, sure. But I mean, mediation is going on right now. If I had to guess, I'm going to guess that it will end up being a payout and they won't go to trial because they just don't want to risk it. But it all comes down to what the plaintiffs are willing to accept, right? The fact that injunctive relief is off the table again changes a lot of this. If that's still on the table, well, then I think it's a little less likely you get a deal done because or the UFC's paying out the wazoo. Maybe actually increases it because the UFC is just like, fine, we'll just do monetary. Let's just get this over with. But we'll see. Either way, don't get caught up in the hype of like, whoa, mediation. Whoa. It's like, no, they're talking to each other. They're trying to resolve it before going to trial. This was always going to happen. That's the only big update there. Again, everything else is kind of set as it was before. So hopefully we get some news on whether the mediation works out or otherwise. April 15th, it's coming up. All right, guys, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. As always, like, subscribe, share, bell notification, share if you are on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, Apple, whatever you listen to podcast wise. Appreciate you as always. And until next time, y'all, get money.